Did Moshe Rabbeinu speak directly to Pharaoh, or was it all via Aaron, his brother? Rashi will teach us that Moshe spoke to Pharaoh, which is interesting considering that Moshe had a speech impediment, and considering that he actually did not speak directly to the Jewish people, at least not at that point in time, which teaches us an incredible lesson about how to deal with the pharaohs of the world, especially the one that lives inside our own head. In response to Moshe's complaint to the Eibishter, which is, I have blocked lips, and therefore how is Pharaoh ever going to listen to me? Straight in Pasuk, so the Pasuk tells us the response. Hashem says to Moshe, don't worry, I have appointed you as an authority over Pharaoh, and Aaron, your brother, he'll be your spokesperson. You will say everything that I instruct you to say, and Aaron will speak to Pharaoh. Now listen to what Rashi says. Is Rashi matik de'aschola? Rashi quotes out of that entire pasuk the beginning, Diverta atos edaber, the words that say that you, Moshe, will speak. And his Mefarsh explains like this: you will speak, Moshe, pam achas. You will speak once to Pharaoh, kol shlichus u'shlichus, at each of the different missions that you have to go to Pharaoh, and you'll speak kafi sheshamata mipi, as you heard from my mouth. And then Aaron, your brother, Yamlitzenu, he'll interpret, V'yatimenu, and he'll present Ba'oznei Pharaoh into Pharaoh's ears. Das heißt, in other words, Rashi learned as Atos Daber Gomer. Rashi learns that when the Torah says that Hashem tells Moshe, you'll speak, and then Aaron will speak after you. Rashi says, don't think that this means Moshe should speak to Aaron and Aaron would then convey the message to Pharaoh, which is the way that the communication works with the Jewish people. We already saw this in last week's parasha. That when Moshe complained to the Eibishter that he is kvad per kvad lashon anochi, that he has difficulty speaking, and therefore the Eibishter should send somebody else. To respond to that, the Eibishter told him, "V'dibarta elav to Aaron. You, Moshe, will only speak to Aaron. V'diberhu l'chayil ha'am gomer, and he will transmit your message to the Jewish people." That's not how it's happening, says Rashi, in the case of Pharaoh. To the Jewish people, it's Moshe, to Aaron, to the Jews. But here, nor as Eich Moshe is already to Pharaoh, here the Eibishter is telling Moshe, you atos sedaber, you must speak to Pharaoh. And the Chelek zwischen Moshe's dibur and Aaron's is not in them. The only distinction between what Moshe says to Pharaoh and what Aaron says to Pharaoh is, was Moshe had gedaf reden bloß pamachas. Moshe will only say the message once each time to Pharaoh. And Aaron hat es gedaf mamlet sein und matim sein beosne Pharaoh, and then Aaron will help to interpret and present it in a way that Pharaoh can actually hear it. To the point that he'll hear it so clearly that he'll send the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. And by the way, the Faris Hashem Moshe brought V'yatimenu be'oznei Pharaoh. You'll see this in Rashi's language, that he says that Aaron's job is to present the message to the ears of Pharaoh, which means Hagamas and Pasuk state Stam el Pharaoh. The Pasuk says, speak to Pharaoh. Rashi wants to link us to what he has already told us in Parashas Vayigash with Yehuda speaking to Yosef. Daber be'oznei Adoni, where Yehuda says, let your servant speak into your ears. Rashi explains that it means the word should actually affect you, should permeate you, should speak to you. Same thing here. Okay, so Rashi is convinced that Moshe has to speak, even if it's just once each time, to Pharaoh. How does he know that? What forces Rashi to say that this communication will be different to the communication to the Jewish people? So what compels Rashi to say that the message is that Moshe has to speak directly to Pharaoh and not via Aaron to Pharaoh, which, as we've mentioned, is different to the communication to the Jewish people. Which, by the way, is the way that various other commentators understand this pasuk. Rashi is not understanding it that way. So there are two reasons why Rashi feels strongly that it has to be that Moshe is speaking directly to Pharaoh. Number one, Aleph, the Torah has already told us that Aaron is going to be the interpreter. So is was darf es the pasuk da yibchazer nachamol? Why would the Torah repeat that? If the message is you speak to Aaron and Aaron speaks to Pharaoh, we already know that because he'll be the Navi. Number two, the pasuk tells us clearly Heim hamedabrim el Pharaoh gomer, in the plural. They, Moshe and Aaron, spoke to Pharaoh, which means Asech Moshe hot geret to Pharaoh. So that means clearly that Moshe was also part of the team that spoke to Pharaoh. Der Ribel and Rashi, therefore Rashi concludes, as the pasuk atas adaber gomer kum zogen, this pasuk that says you will speak to Pharaoh means, as Moshe is already to Pharaoh, that Moshe will at some point speak directly to Pharaoh himself. It's just that he'll only say the message once, and then Aaron's job will be to unpack it. Okay, so that's what Rashi is telling us. Moshe has to speak to Pharaoh once per communication. Now, there are a few questions we have to ask about this, because there's some really disturbing thoughts that should be going through our heads at this point in time. First of all, we have to understand alle free in Parashat Shmos. Earlier in Parashat Shmos, we're told, as noch dem, as noch dem, was Moshe waren haben zum aufgeklimmen die Ziknei so v'chulei. What happened earlier, already in Parashat Shmos, after Moshe and Aaron gathered and communicated with the Jewish people, then Moshe and Aaron came to Pharaoh and they gave him a message. The message being that Hashem, the God of the Hebrews, of the Jewish people, has said, "Send my people away, and if you touch them, I'm going to touch your Bechorim." Right? So that message was already communicated. Now there it also says they spoke. Vayoimru, they spoke. That would imply, that would imply that there too, Moshe also spoke to Pharaoh. But Frat, as the pasuk is Meshana from Freer, especially when you consider that there too the Torah makes a distinction between when it comes to speaking to the elders of the Jewish people. There it's pretty clear that it's only Aaron speaking the words that Moshe gave to him from Hashem. Whereas when speaking to Pharaoh, it's in the plural. So we already have precedent of Moshe speaking to Pharaoh. Pashtas is mistaber, and there's great logic for this. As a Yos, Moshe is given a kvad loshen, because Moshe battled to speak. Which is why the Eibishter agreed that Aaron would be his representative, interpreter, etc. So it makes sense that obviously Moshe is not going to speak more than necessary and in detail. So it makes sense that Moshe would give the salient points and Aaron would be the one to fluff it up and give the details. So if that's the case, the way that Moshe and Aaron presented to Pharaoh already in Parashat Shmos sounds pretty much like the way that they're presenting now in Parashat Voeira, and for which reason we have a big question. If, as Rashi tells us, it is important for the Torah to have us know that Moshe speaks to Pharaoh, and then Aaron comes along and fills in the detail. As Moshe read Pamachas, that Moshe says the message once, and then Aaron has to interpret and present it. Surely the Torah should have told us that the very first time that Moshe and Aaron went to speak to Pharaoh, which is back in Parashat Shmos. Why doesn't it mention then? You'll say, didn't mention it then because it's self-understood. And if it is self-understood, as when beide haben gerät, that any scenario where both Moshe and Aaron speaks, hat Moshe gerät bekitzer, Moshe obviously spoke as briefly as possible, because it was difficult for him to speak. And therefore, obviously, on Aaron hat matem given seine Rede, Aaron obviously expanded on his words. So if it's that obvious in Parashat Shmos, why does the pasuk have to spell it out for us over here in Parashat Voeira? All we have to say is very briefly, as Moshe soll mit Zorv sein zu sich Aaronen, then Moshe should take Aaron as his partner in the communication. Al derech wie the pasuk und Rashi sagt früher, As the pasuk and Rashi have already pointed out, when the pasuk earlier said "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aaron," that Hashem spoke to Moshe and to Aaron, that it means because Moshe said that it's difficult for him to speak. So he had Aaron as his partner. So it doesn't make sense. If it needs to be explained, it should have been explained the very first time they both presented to Pharaoh in Parashat Shmos. If it's that obvious that it doesn't need to be explained, why does the pasuk tell us in our parasha? Beis aggressor to me. Then there's an even more powerful question. Was is bechlal gewend die Taine von Moshe Rabbeinu do hein ani aral sefosayim? Why here in Parshas Voeira is Moshe complaining about his speech impediment? He's already mentioned this concern back at the time of the snare, the burning bush, where he said, a battle to speak. And already then, the Eibishter gave him a solution, which was, that Aaron will be your mouthpiece. And was ist jetzt wieder einmal gekommen mit derselbe Taina, so why is Moshe repeating what appears to be the same complaint, the same doubt? It's been resolved. Or to look at it from the other angle. If there's something new that Moshe is concerned about in the term aral sefosayim, which is different to kvad po, kvad loshen. For whatever reason, therefore, Moshe is not satisfied with having Aaron as his representative. Then how did Eibishter resolve it? By saying Aaron will be your spokesperson, which surely is exactly the same answer he gave him before. So what's changed? Why are you complaining about the same issue? Why are you getting the same answer? So we'll see that some of the Meforshim attempt an answer which the Rebbe will not be satisfied with. Meforshim enfern of the Tzveite Shaila, Meforshim addresses by saying, that when Moshe said, I'm kvad peru kvad loshen, at that point he was saying, so therefore I can't speak to the Jewish people. But the pasuk is dot madgish, b'diber hu lecha el ha'am, as Hashem's response indicates, where Hashem says, don't worry, Aaron will speak to the people. Whereas here there's a new responsibility, which is to speak to Pharaoh, which may require more eloquence. Und der Pharao hat Moshe da wieder geteilt an ihr aus Versailles, which might have been the reason that Moshe here says, whoa, hang on a second. Maybe to speak to my own people is one thing, but to speak to Pharaoh, I don't have the capacity to speak. Und der Eibishter hat geantwortet, als ich bei der Schlichus zu Pharaoh war noch ich Neviachot, to which the Meforshim say, that's why the Eibishter had to tell him, don't worry, here too, Aaron will be your mouthpiece. There's two reasons why the Rebbe doesn't feel that this is a sufficient answer. Aber es ist schwer, als zu sagen. It's difficult to give this answer, weil alle firstly, bald ein Hemmschach von der ersten Rede, wo der Eibishter hat angesagt, dass Moshe so während der Shliach Hashem. Straight away, at the very first time that the Eibishter communicates to Moshe that he will be the representative to do these jobs, während schon der Mann bei der Shlichusen, he mentions both jobs. Gather the elders of the Jewish people, so that's the job to speak to the Yidden, as well as the job that I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. In other words, Moshe was already conscious of the fact that he had two roles, one to the Jews, one to Pharaoh. Is therefore moving as the tshuva von Eibishter hu yelachol peh. So therefore, when the Eibishter at that point told him, Aaron will be your mouthpiece, that addresses both when you speak to the Jews and when you speak to Pharaoh. So it's not feasible to say now he's got a new problem because he's got a new audience to speak to Pharaoh and he has to readdress his speech impediment. But even more importantly than that, Beis V'yikar, mit etliche Psukim weiter, few Psukim down the line, noch in der Szenen, as the Eibishter hat Masken gewinnt, hu yelachol peh. After the Eibishter concurred with Moshe that Aaron would be his representative, then the Pasuk tells us, as the Eibishter hat gesagt zu Moshe befeirosh, that the Eibishter told Moshe clearly, belechdecha lashuv Mitzrayim, when you go back to Mitzrayim, re'ei kol ha'moisim goyim, look at the various signs I'm about to show you, the miracles I'm about to show you, Vasisam lifnei Paroi Goimer, and you'll do those signs in front of Paroi, ve'omarta el Paroi Goimer, and you'll give Paroi the message, Beni b'chor Yisrael. And we don't find at that point that Moshe says, whoa, speaking to Paroi, the Jews I can handle, but speaking to Paroi, he doesn't bring it up at that point. Therefore, muss man sagen, we have no choice but to conclude, as hat angenommen, that Moshe was klias chod do vet eich musen reden zu Paro v'amarta. That even though here he has to speak to Pharaoh as well, it's different to the Jews. To the Jews, he doesn't have to speak to the Jews. Aaron will be the spokesperson. But here, he has to speak to Pharaoh. That's clear to him. And yet, von deswegen kann mitnehmen Aaron lepe, he's still allowed to take Aaron along as well. Okay, so we've got to understand the dynamic of what's the difference between speaking to the Jewish people where Aaron does the speaking to Pharaoh where Moshe does the speaking and then Aaron takes over, and why it seems that we have the same questions repeating with the same answers responding. And in order to understand all of that, we first have to look at 5 different nuances in the language that Rashi uses over here. 4 different nuances. So here 4 things we're going to analyze in the language that Rashi chooses for his Pirush. Aleph. Says, one thing's clear, Moshe must have spoken as succinctly as possible. And Aaron became the great eloquent spokesperson because Moshe obviously found it difficult to speak. How does Rashi know that the message to Moshe was speak once to Pharaoh each time and nothing further? How does he know that? Number 2, base. Why does Rashi say that you'll speak once per shlichus? Surely it would have made a lot more sense to say you'll give each instruction. Tzivoy is an expression that relates to how you talk. Shlichus is the overarching responsibility that you have. And plus, the word tzivoy would match the words in the pasuk, which is, speak to Pharaoh what I instruct you. Question 3. Rashi says that he has to give him kol shlichus or shlichus kefisha shamata mipi. Transmit the message as you heard it from my mouth. Surely Rashi didn't have to tell us that. Did any of us imagine that Moshe would say something to Pharaoh not in the way that he heard it from the Eibishter? This is Moshe Rabbeinu we're talking about. And lastly, why does Rashi use 2 words to explain how Aaron will present to Pharaoh? Yamlitzenu, which means to interpret, and Yatimenu, which means to make things almost suitable or prepared for the audience. So to understand all of that, let's understand the different terminology that is used to describe Moshe's apparent speech impediment. Der Birndem wird sein verstandig behagtem lehasbir, was Moshe hat in sein Teine da meshane gewend von sein friedige Teine. Let's begin by seeing the difference in the wording of how Moshe verbalizes his question, doubt, or issue with going to speak to Pharaoh versus earlier going to speak to the Jewish people. In Parsha Shmois hat gesagt, kvad per u kvad loshen anochi. In Parsha Shmois, at the burning bush, he says to the Eibishter, how can I go speak to the Jewish people? I have a heavy tongue and a heavy mouth. Und da, whereas here he says, my lips are blocked. Aber fratas like Rashi is the Sashine nit neuen Loschen. And when you look at how Rashi explains the 2 of them, it's not just 2 different expressions. No, it's 2 different impediments. When he says initially, I have a heavy mouth and tongue, is Rashi meforish Rashi explains that means I find it difficult to speak. Das heißt, as I can reden, he can communicate. Now, das kommt ihm beim Michvedus, but it's a struggle, it's a battle. Mashin ken arals vosayim, teach Rashi, but when Rashi translates arals vosayim, he translates it as otum svosayim. The lips are blocked. Seine Lippen sind verstopft. Es ist eine Störung zum Reden. Means you can't talk. Kvad per kvad loshen means you can talk with difficulty. Arals vosayim means you can't talk. Und das der Chiddush in sein zweiter Teine. That gives us insight into what was new about what Moshe said to the Eibishter when it was time to speak to Pharaoh. Früher hat gemeint, as es bloß kvad per kvad loshen. Initially he said, my big challenge is I find it difficult to speak. Can reden. I'll call upon it. If I need to speak, I can get the words out. Und der Rebbe hatte zu massig mitzunehmen Aaron, and therefore take Aaron along. That will help. Was wird Marchum Matim sein, das was Moshe wird sagen, bekitze to Pharaoh. So if it's difficult for me to speak, that's okay. I'll give a brief message, and Aaron will expand on it for Pharaoh's benefit. Aber ist es gekommen zu der Korah, aus Vosayim, but now Moshe Rabbeinu recognizes it's not only that it's difficult for me to speak, I cannot speak. Sein Reden ist nicht nur nicht bekalles, not only is it not easy to speak, nor in ganzen nicht möglich, it's not possible to speak. It's as if he was mute. So why am I going to Pharaoh? If I'm going to say a message and Aaron's going to expand on it, great. But if I can't say a message, why go to Pharaoh at all? In fact, going to Pharaoh might be counterproductive. If he's going to go to Pharaoh, listen to Aaron's presentation and Pharaoh's response and be quiet, so not only will it not be helpful, as a number of the Mefarshim say, will actually be destructive. Could be that when Pharaoh pushes back and says, actually we're going to increase the workload, and Moshe says nothing, it might sound like tacit consent. So he's saying to the Eibishter, why should I go to Pharaoh? I'm going to be counterproductive. So then the Eibishter doesn't just say to him, you must speak. He says, das ist nicht nur a Zivui, du sollst reden. Doesn't only tell me you have to speak to Pharaoh, not zusammen damit Havtocha, du wirst reden. He's giving an assurance, you will be able to speak to Pharaoh. As Choche is an aral svosayim, that yes, you have a biological impediment that does not allow you to speak, I will empower you to break through that impediment. On the Rebbe's Rashi Medayak, that helps understand why Rashi is so specific that it's called shlichus or shlichus v'chulei. That it's each mission that you go on, you'll be able to speak. Because Rashi wants us to know that when Moshe speaks to Pharaoh, it's not natural. It's not Moshe using his personal resources. Nor der Fall, was is gegangen, it's because he's Hashem's shliach. Therefore he can talk. Moshe cannot talk. Moshe, as the dedicated shliach of Hashem, can miraculously talk. Und das hat ihm gegeben Koach v'cheles zu reden, and that's what empowers him to be able to say the words. Und das kommt behemshach zu dem, was Rashi is meforish mit etliche psukim früher, and that aligns with something that that Rashi already told us earlier, which is, when Hashem tells Moshe, Ani Hashem, says Rashi, it means, Kedai ani l'shalechacha, I am suited to send you on this mission, ulakayim divrei shlichusi, and to ensure that the words of the shlichus are fulfilled. Asis genug dos was ani is the mishalech. The message is the fact that I, Eibishter, am the one sending you on this mission is sufficient to make the shlichus succeed. That's the broader picture that Moshe Rabbeinu will be able to succeed in his shlichus to take the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. In the more specific sense, because the Eibishter sends him on this mission, therefore he'll be able to speak. And that also helps us to understand why Rashi gives us so much detail, some of which appears to be unnecessary. You're going to speak once, kol shlichus shlichus, on each of the missions, as you heard from my mouth. All of that information is relevant to understand the miraculous nature of Moshe's communication with Pharaoh. The kavana for Moshe's gain reden to Pharaoh, Moshe speaking to Pharaoh was not a rational conversation between two people at a peace summit. Is nicht given to einreden Paramit as Boris v'taimim. The goal is not to convince Pharaoh with some kind of logical explanation why he should let the Jewish people go. Not sie begeben die Shlichus von Eibishter. Moshe's job is to convey the Eibishter's mission. In other words, Moshe is given the Shliach Hashem. Was hat gerät zu Parim beim Koimah v'keich ham Shelech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe's role in this is not to make beautiful, eloquent speeches, but to be the conduit of Hashem's message to Pharaoh. That's his job. When you look at Moshe speaking, you shouldn't hear the brilliant speaker, you should hear the godly message. Of a Mela, which is why he had to give the verbatim transmission of what Eibishter said. No additions, no eloquence. Hat es gedarf sagen bloß, Pam Achas, that's why he would say the message once. Punkt für der Eibishter hat es gesagt, Pam Achas, exactly like the Eibishter would give him the message once. Und kafisha shamato mipi, and he had to convey it in exactly the same words that he heard it from the Eibishter, mit demselben Lashon bediuk. Voeira hat es gehört von the Eibishter. In exactly the same words, language, nuance that he heard from the Eibishter. Dabei stellt sich aber die Scheile, now you'll ask a simple question. Der Dibur von Eibishter zu Moshe ist doch given b'Lashon HaKodesh. What's the purpose? Moshe Rabbeinu hears the Eibishter's message in Lashon HaKodesh. Over Meili is like Dibur shel Moshe tzipar given b'Lashon HaKodesh k'fi sheshamata mipi. And Moshe now has to share that message verbatim, which means Moshe is now speaking Lashon HaKodesh to Pharaoh. What's the value in that? Isn't it moving? Rashi hat schon früher meforisch given in Parashas Vayechi. Rashi already told us in Parashas Vayechi, as Pharaoh had nit makeh given Lashon HaKodesh, that Pharaoh doesn't understand Lashon HaKodesh. That's the whole deal he had with Yosef about the promise. Don't tell anybody, you know a language, I don't know. Heint, wie also hat gekannt verstehen, was Moshe hat gesagt bei Lashon HaKodesh. So what's the value? What's Pharaoh going to understand from Moshe speaking to him in Lashon HaKodesh that he doesn't understand at all? The Rebbe is Rashi Mamshech, therefore Rashi says, the double expression that Rashi uses. Why? Was Yamlitzeno hatten sich euch dem Teich von übersetzen von einer Sprache verzweiter. Because the word Yamlitzenu could also mean to interpret a language. Rashi hat shown for him before given in Parashas Miketz, as Rashi's already told us in Parashas Miketz with Yosef and the brothers, even Posaki HaMeilitz Beinosan, where the brothers didn't know that Yosef understood what they were saying because there was a Meilitz. What's a Meilitz? An interpreter. Says Rashi, because typically when they had a conversation, the Meilitz was the interpreter who was able to interpret Lashon HaKodesh for Yosef, and Egyptian for the brothers. So we know that Yam Litzen means to translate. In other words, Moshe is speaking a language that Pharaoh does not understand, and part of Aaron's job is to translate it. So Aaron has two roles to play in this communication. First, he's got to translate. From the Sprach von Divrei Moshe. He's got to take the words Moshe said and convey them in a language that Pharaoh understands. And then, in addition to that, he's got to expand on it. Explain what the content actually means. In a way that Pharaoh will be able to hear it and absorb it on a personal level. Now, is noch als nicht glattig. You probably still have a question at this point. Either way, Pharaoh is not going to understand what Moshe is saying, and Aaron has to translate it. So what's the value of Moshe speaking at all? To the extent that David has to essentially make a miracle for him, to empower him to speak when he can't normally speak, to say something that Pharaoh is not going to understand anyway. What's the point? Is there or so the point is you've got to understand what Moshe's role is. Moshe's role is not the communicator in the classical sense. Moshe's role is to take control, to become an authority figure over Pharaoh, as we already saw in the earlier pasuk. Das kommt bei Hemshech zu Pirush Rashi in Friedikin pasuk. Rashi already explained this in an earlier pasuk, where the pasuk said, "Nesaticho lekim leFaroi," that David says, "I have made you an authority over Pharaoh." It says, Rashi, what kind of an authority? Shofet, you'll be the judge. Veroide, and somebody who will berate him, who will denigrate him. Lerdoisev makis v'yisurin, you'll cause him pain, you'll afflict him. Das heißt, Moshe's inyan is in seine Rede zu Pharaoh. What's Moshe's role in his communication to Pharaoh? Not to explain things, not to speak rationally. That's Aaron's tafkid. That's Aaron's job. Aaron has to be the novi, the one who interprets, the one who explains. What's Moshe's job? Not him to shefet sein, to show him who's in control, to judge him. To literally smack him and beat him into submission. That's Moshe's job. Moshe's job is to beat Pharaoh down to the point that he lets the Jewish people go. And that's relevant in our discussion here. Moshe Rabbeinu hat gedarf sagen zu Pharaoh, shalach es an mi. What did Moshe have to communicate to Pharaoh? Let the Yidden go. Mit der Strengkeit beißen sich auf ihm. He had to do it with strength, with strictness, with anger almost. As von einem Eifen Hadibur, where the way that he's speaking, and his facial expressions while he's speaking, so Pharaoh will realize that this is something extremely severe, even if he doesn't understand the words. Similar to if he was being physically beaten. So why does Moshe speak to convey the Eibishter's message in a way that disempowers Pharaoh? Let's take it deeper. Let's look at the appreciation of Chassidus. This principle of Moshe being appointed as the authority over Pharaoh, which means to literally beat him down with severity and power. In Chassidus Mevoir, Chassidus explains why this had to happen. Says Chassidus, anytime the Klippa is in a powerful position, which can only happen because they're leeching onto positive energy that somehow became available to the Klippa. When Klippa is powerful, even a great tzaddik cannot break or diminish the Klippa. You see this in the Gemara that says, if you see that there's a Rasha who's like their fortune is smiling on him, don't start up with him at that point in time. The only one who could bring down the Klippas from their place of strength is the Eibishter, who could do anything. So even a Rasha who is elevated to the highest level of personal arrogance should, as the pasuk says, be brought to the ground and literally crushed under our feet. And das meant re'ei. That's why when the pasuk describes how the Eibishter tells Moshe that you're going to be in charge of Pharaoh, he says re'ei. Re'ei means see something, lashon chidush or something amazing and unexpected. I am empowering you to be an authority over Pharaoh at a time where life is good for him, where the fortune seems to shine on him. Hagam, as Pharaoh is not given betokvoi, despite the fact that Pharaoh is sitting on top of the world, to the point that no single slave could ever escape his clutches. The Eibishter gave Moshe power over Pharaoh almost as if he's like the Eibishter himself. To the point that he could literally beat him down. Und der Koyach is gegeben geworden dafke zu Moshe. Out of all the tzaddikim throughout history, who has this kind of power? Moshe Rabbeinu. Varum. Zayin dek the Nasi Hadar. First of all, he is the Nasi Hadar. As the pasuk tells us that he's the one who stands between Hashem and the Jewish people to convey the Eibishter's messages to us. The kind of conduit that actually brings Hashem's word into this world. Because he's that unique kind of a tzaddik, he is the conduit of godliness into this world, so therefore he's able to bring the Eibishter's power to overcome Pharaoh into this world. By the way, this also explains why, in spite of the fact that the Chachamim tell us that you don't start up with a Rasha during his good times, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says you can, and he did with the Romans. Even when fortune seems to be on their side. That's because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama, ki yadua, as the Arizal tells us. And therefore he has the power to overwhelm Rishoim, even when they're at the prime of their lives. Das is the Tam Pnimi Favos Moshe Rabbeinu had gemus reden zu Pharaoh, and that's why Moshe has to speak to Pharaoh. Despite his speech impediment, despite the language barrier, he has to speak to Pharaoh because the message from the Eibishter to Pharaoh can only be conveyed through Moshe. It wouldn't be sufficient just to have Aaron share the content. And Beis Chachas the Dibur is given in Ashprach was Pharaoh nicht verstanden, and in spite of the fact that it's a different language that Pharaoh wouldn't understand. Because the objectives of Moshe speaking is not to communicate, it's to smash Pharaoh. While Pharaoh is at his zenith. To do that, and the Rebbe Aleph is not Moshe, only Moshe could succeed in doing so. Basis nitayim from birur no shvira l'irdoisei chulei. There's no opportunity here to elevate, to refine, to transform Pharaoh. All that needs to happen is to humiliate and destroy Pharaoh. And says defining as because we're not looking to refine or transform Pharaoh, he doesn't have to understand what's being said. He just has to be affected by the power of what's being said. This explains why Rashi insists that the way in which Moshe would convey the message had to be literally in the words that you heard from my mouth, says Hashem. Meaning, the capacity to break klippa when they are in their prime. What Moshe Rabbeinu gehat mitzadem, was says given to Shliach Hashem, is not something Moshe Rabbeinu has in his own abilities. It's only as the perfect representative of Hashem. That through him, the Eibishter's strength could be presented, like as if he had the arm of Hashem, so to speak. And the Rebbe is the Dibber given an ofen von Atose Daber Kefisha Shamata Mipi. That's why Moshe has to speak exactly as the words were from Hashem, which is very similar. Al derech Shechina medaberes mitoich groino shel Moshe, the famous description of how when Moshe speaks, it's actually the Shechina communicating. Damit kann man euch mevoir sein, was der Seder von Atose Daber Pamachas Koshlichus Ushlichus Kefisha Shamata Mipi Chule. Now we can understand the flow. You have to, Moshe Rabbeinu, speak once at each shlichus exactly the words that you heard from our mouth. Is something that only became available to Moshe after he says Ani Aros Fosayim. See, most people think that Moshe's speech impediment was some kind of a birth defect. But Chassidus explains that Moshe's inability to speak is an indicator of his extremely developed spiritual nature. It says Mavor Chassidus, as das was Moshe is given kvad per kvad loshen, Chassidus explains why is it that Moshe battled to speak. Because there is no person called Moshe that is independent enough to have something to say. Moshe is completely submissive to the Eibishter, total surrender, absolute bittul. And therefore, so because Moshe is completely invisible in his surrender to Hashem and his bittul to Hashem, he doesn't have the capacity in and of himself to share from himself. It's similar to the halacha in kashrus, that when something is in the process of absorbing, at that time it cannot be sharing. So Moshe Rabbeinu is absorbing godliness without any sense of self. So what's he sharing? How's he sharing with others? Can't speak. So if the inability to speak is a representation of Moshe Rabbeinu's bittul, therefore, his move on, then you can understand as ich the von Arals Vosayim weißt of Gedel Abitel for Moshe Rabbeinu. Then, when you have the description of Arals of Vosayim, it must also relate to this tremendous bittul to Hashem. In fact, Arals Vosayim indicates a far more extreme type of bittul to Hashem than Kvad Kvad Loshen. As Rashi already told us, Vorum Kvad Kvad Loshen meint, as es ist noch geblieben die Brashpo, nos is bichveidus. Rashi told us, Kvad Peuch Kvad Loshen means that there is an ability to speak, but it's difficult to speak. In other words, there's an ability to be mashpia, but it's not natural. Noch nit bittul legamri. There's not absolute bittul where the person is completely invisible. Arals Vosayim beweist of bittul betachlis, whereas Arals Vosayim, that means can't get a word out. Was der Far kann in ganzen nit reden, because he's got absolute bittul to Hashem, and therefore there are no words to come out. On der Ribber, that's why it's dafka der bittul von Arals Vosayim. Only once it becomes apparent that Moshe has that degree of bittul to Hashem, that Arals Vosayim, there is no mouth of Moshe's. That is given the Isarusa de la Sata. That was the initiation from Moshe's reality, so to speak, from below, which opened the pathway for the Eibishter appointing him as the authority over Pharaoh. In other words, durch ein Bittel in an Eifem von bli shum hergesh klal. When Moshe Rabbeinu reaches a level of bittul where there's no personal feelings at all, ken der noch sein, then it is possible to be open al derech von Shechina medaberes mitoich groino shel Moshe, similar to the idea of the Shechina speaking through Moshe Rabbeinu. How is that possible? Only when Moshe is completely transparent. Likewise, that he could say the Eibishter's words literally, v'sapfaden sich to the shvira from Pharaoh, which is, of course, what is necessary to break Pharaoh. Only once Moshe has expressed, Ani ar el sfosayim, I'm a nothing, nobody, I don't exist. Now, you may still have one other question. Wie kommt es? Was Davka Pharaoh hat gehört, der Shlichus Hashem euch von Moshe allein. How does it make sense that Pharaoh hears Moshe speaking directly Hashem's word and not the Yidden? I mean, soll haben es gehört bloß von Aaron, but Dibur L'Cholam. The Yidden only hear the message second hand through Aaron HaKohen. How does that work out? You might argue as Bnei Yisrael haben nicht gedacht on kommen zu dem, that the Yidden didn't need that intensity of message because they didn't need to be broken. Mashenkin the Shvir from Paraklippa Betokva, whereas Paroi, who is Klippa in its zenith, needs that very intense pressure to break. And therefore obviously needed Moshe's direct intervention. Or to put it more simply, the Yidden already believe in God, they already believe in Moshe's message. The Rebbe, as far as they can know that Aaron gets a Yibber, so it would be enough to hear that message via Aaron. They wouldn't need to be, so to speak, convinced. As long as Aaron represents Moshe, they'll listen. Was Moshe had gehört from Eibishter, and they know that Moshe got the message from Eibishter. When they hear it, is they believe it. Whereas by Pharaoh, Voltos nit maspik given. Pharaoh doesn't have any pre-existing faith in God, so it's not good enough to give him a message that Aaron's going to say he heard from Moshe, who heard from Hashem, and therefore Moshe had to speak. So fine, the Yidden don't need it, but why not have it? Should it be better for them to have Moshe's direct communication? And deswegen ist es nicht glattig, it's still not clear. Why do the Yidden lose out this incredible opportunity of Moshe speaking to them directly, which Pharaoh gets? So the Bir and them explanation is when Aaron speaks to the Yidden, it's a completely different experience to when he speaks to Pharaoh. Is es done by him nor bederach mavor. Aaron is a conduit when he speaks to the Yidden. The Yidden, when they hear the message, don't hear in the message anything less because it came out of Aaron's mouth. For them, it's like it came out of Moshe's mouth, which is, by the way, how the whole of Torah works. That's the whole way that tradition works. It was passed from Moshe, who got it from Har Sinai, to Yeshua, to the Skenim, to Hashaknes Agdol, etc. Despite the fact that the Torah has passed through many, many intermediaries over the generations. Von deswegen results die Torah mi Sinai. We still call it right from the beginning the Torah from Sinai. To the point that even today, if a brilliant student gives a new insight into Torah, we say that's the Torah as it was received from Moshe and Har Sinai. By the Jewish people, there's no obstacles, there's no obstructions. So you hear it from Aaron, you hear it from your rabbi in Shul, you know it's Moshe's word, you know it's the Eibishter's word. Pharaoh is completely different. If Pharaoh would only receive Moshe's message via Aaron, we know that in order for Aaron to transmit that message, he has to change it. He's got to translate it. He's got to explain it. Through the translation, things get lost in translation. And so the force that is required to smash Pharaoh would be absent. The content would be there, but the force wouldn't be there. When we learn Torah, the force of Torah is still there. And that explains why the descriptions of how Moshe would speak via Aaron to the Yidden is different to how Aaron would spread his message or share his message with Pharaoh. When Aaron is speaking on Moshe's behalf to the Jewish people, the experience is it's Moshe's mouth speaking. Whereas by Pharaoh, it's when Aaron speaks to Pharaoh, that's Moshe's spokesperson, translator. So the Yidden see Aaron as Moshe's mouthpiece. Aaron's Dibur is given in the selbe Darge wie wenn kommt von Peshel Moshe bederach Mavar. Their experience of the information is it's like it came from Moshe's mouth through a conduit that creates no barriers or obstructions. Whereas Aaron's role to Pharaoh is interpretive, like Rashi tells us, the translator. Any time that something is transmitted via translation, it's obviously going to be a completely different and lesser experience for the recipients, as is explained extensively in other places in Chassidus. So Moshe, to give the kifus, the power of the Eibishter's word, which will break Pharaoh, has to say the words himself. So what's the lesson? Personal lesson for us is, sometimes our neshama is trapped within the golus created by our animal soul. Sometimes to the extent that fortune seems to shine on the nefesh habahamis. The klipa is in our matzah from gasus, where the klipa in our lives is very elevated. Shemagbia atzma lo kedushas nefesh halikis chule, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, where the nefesh halikis has the chutzpah to override and envelop and overwhelm the light and godliness of nefesh halikis. So what do? How do we break that cycle when we feel trapped by the nefesh halikis? By the nefesh habahamis? And the message is we've got to be like Moshe Rabbeinu, recognize that we have authority over the Pharaoh within to smash it. To borrow an expression from Tanya, which is from the Gemara, that a person has to create almost an anger and agitation of the Yetzer Tov over the Yetzer Hara. As the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, you got to rail loudly against your nefesh habahamis, against your Yetzer Hara, to degrade it. To say you're bad, Rasha, Meshukot, Mesuiv, etc. And das Kufa brechti gas aklip of nefesh habahamis kimvur baruch in Tanya, as the Alter Rebbe explains extensively in Tanya. It is that forceful degrading of the nefesh habahamis of the Yetzer Hara that breaks it. That's what we have to do. So how do we get the power to be able to do this? We have the power to be able to break our own nefesh habahamis, our own Yetzer Hara, thanks to Moshe Rabbeinu, who was empowered by the Eibishter to be the authority over and the one to disempower Pharaoh. And that's how every one of us actually has the capacity within ourselves. Because as we well know, every one of us, the Alter Rebbe says, our neshama has a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama. And if that's true for everybody, if that's true of the Jewish people, and certainly of the Nasi Hadar, Nasi Hu HaKoil, as we know, Rashi tells us the Nasi Hadar incorporates all of the generation. Just as Moshe in his time had the power to be able to overwhelm and override Pharaoh, even at his best time, same thing in every generation. As the Nasi Hadar, the Rebbe of the generation, who is the extension of Moshe within that generation, is empowered to break all of the obstructions and all of the concealments against Kedusha, regardless of how powerful they may appear. And das sagt the answer to Divas Tainan, which is a great answer to those people who complain. Seeing as we live in the doubled darkness of this generation, the final generation at the bottom of the pile before Mashiach comes. With so many challenges and obstructions and blurring of holiness. People say, how in this context can we fulfill the expectation of our Rabbeim to mefiz sein dem limit teres Chassidus und die Halicha bedarch Chassidus b'chol mokem u'mokem? How are we going to spread the teachings of Chassidus and the conduct of Chassidus all over the place? Aber frat in the Erde, was matzav is so niedrig, as es einen gomenem makev v'chulei, especially in those environments that are so challenging and limiting of spiritual development. How can you do it? In this world of secularism and liberalism and all these various things that seem to be such an incredible challenge. Darf man wissen, as is Bashut Moshe b'chol dora v'dora, oichin dora dik v'sin Mashiach. So we have to know that there is a Moshe representation in every generation, including ours. Ve'adraba, in fact, to the contrary, because we know that our generation, the generation at the heels of Mashiach, are the reincarnations of the souls of the generation that followed Moshe Rabbeinu into the desert. So what that generation went through is something we go through too, and the resources they had are available to us too. So therefore, by us having a meaningful connection with the Rebbe of our generation, which the Rebbe says is the Frierdiker Rebbe, but of course we understand it's for us the Rebbe. We have nothing to fear from all these apparent obstructions and concealments and distractions, because we all have the power to smash down those walls. Moshe Rabbeinu had the power to bring down Pharaoh. Obviously, we have to proceed in a way that is peaceful, as the Rebbe wanted us to. As we well know, the Frierdiker Rebbe asked from his father for a bracha that his leadership as a Rebbe should be in a way of chesed and rachamim, compassion and kindness. But you have to know one thing. When we are bound to the Rebbe, which can only be achieved by learning what the Rebbe teaches, following those things that the Rebbe instituted, and following in the path and the footsteps of the Rebbe, then we have nothing to fear. There is no barrier in the world that we cannot breach. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu then was able to bring Pharaoh down and to free all the Jewish people with a powerful outstretched arm, the same will happen for us. Despite how difficult and challenging the Golus is, the Rebbe of our generation will lead us out of this Golus to the ultimate Geula, Biyad Rama, with pride and expanse, and it should happen immediately.